Alan sat on the couch, staring at Kathy, his thoughts racing. His heart felt heavy, burdened by the words he had to say. He shook his head, his voice calm but firm. "I've been thinking about this for a while, Kathy. I can't pretend this isn't a deal breaker for me. I want a relationship that's built to last, not one that stays fresh by tearing down its foundation." He saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Confusion, maybe frustration, but he didn't back down. Alan's mind drifted back to their beginning. He remembered the first time he saw her, sitting at a crowded cafe with a book in her hands. Her hair caught the light just so, and when she looked up and met his eyes, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. It was like finding a missing puzzle piece. "Hi, I'm Alan," he had said, his voice shaky but determined. From that moment, they had been inseparable. A year later, that feeling hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. He smiled faintly at the memories. Lazy Sundays spent hiking together, collapsing at diners, Kathy stealing his fries with a mischievous smirk. Evenings binge-watching crime thrillers and rom-coms, their laughter filling the room. Her relentless optimism, the way she always knew when to listen and when to push him out of his comfort zone. She wasn't just his girlfriend, she was his best friend, his confidant. Kathy had become woven into his life, into his very being. His family adored her. His friends accepted her without question. She was the kind of person who lit up a room without trying, the kind who made strangers feel like old friends. Kathy was his future. He imagined rings exchanged, vows whispered, a home filled with warmth and laughter. Stability, loyalty, partnership. All of it felt within reach, until now. Now, all of that felt fragile, shaken. Earlier that morning, Kathy had taken a call from her mom. He had been in the kitchen, pouring coffee, when he heard the shift in her tone. "Wait, what?" she had said, her voice tight. She paused, listening, and then sighed. "Okay, yeah. Thanks for telling me. I'll call you later." Alan walked over, concern etched on his face. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. She turned to him, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just got some bad news. My parents are getting a divorce." His sympathy was immediate. He pulled her into a hug, murmuring, "I'm sorry." "That's tough." She shrugged against him. "It's not a shock. They've been in an open marriage for years. I guess it just stopped working." Alan pulled back slightly, his brow furrowing. "Wait, what? Open marriage?" She nodded, her voice light, almost dismissive. "Yeah, it's how they kept things fresh. It's normal in my family." The room fell silent. Alan's thoughts raced, questions swirling in his mind. How had he not known this? In all their time together, in all the conversations they'd had about life and love, this had never come up. Normal? The word echoed in his head, twisting his stomach. Had been raised to believe commitment meant exclusivity, loyalty, trust. Hearing Kathy describe open relationships like they were casual, everyday choices made him question everything. "So, how do you feel about open relationships?" he asked finally, trying to keep his tone neutral. She shrugged again, as if the answer was obvious. "They work for some people. If there's honesty and communication, what's the harm?" He stared at her, searching for reassurance, for some hint that she didn't mean it for them. But her calm certainty only made his chest tighten. Kathy noticed the shift in Alan's demeanor, the tension in his jaw. She felt the growing gap between them, a space once filled with laughter and understanding, now thick with unspoken questions. She reached for his hand, her voice soft. "Relationships evolve," she said, trying to bridge the divide. "They're not one size fits all. People change." But Alan's silence was louder than any argument. He couldn't shake the disappointment. The Kathy he thought he knew, the one who valued stability and partnership, felt like a stranger. Was this always who she was? Or had he missed the signs? For the first time, he doubted their future. The image of the life they'd build together began to crumble, piece by piece. He wasn't sure he could find a way to put it back together, and that thought terrified him. The hours stretched on, the weight of their conversation hanging heavily between them. Alan couldn't concentrate on work. His mind kept circling back to Kathy's words. He tried to rationalize, to tell himself that her parents' choices didn't have to reflect her own. But the doubt lingered, an unwelcome intruder that refused to leave. Kathy, meanwhile, wrestled with her own thoughts. She hadn't meant to upset Alan, but she couldn't ignore the tension that had settled between them. She replayed their conversation over and over, wondering if she had said too much or too little. She loved Alan deeply, but she also believed in honesty. She had shared her truth, hoping it would bring them closer, but it seemed to have pushed him away. That evening, Alan sat on the couch, his head in his hands. Kathy sat across from him, her eyes searching his face. "Alan," she began, her voice steady but vulnerable, "I need to know what you're thinking. Please talk to me." He looked up, his eyes tired. "I'm trying, Kathy. I'm trying to understand. But this is big for me. I thought we were on the same page about what we wanted in a relationship." "We are," she insisted. "I want a future with you, Alan. But I also believe in being open about what works for us. My parents' relationship isn't ours. I shared that with you because I thought it was important, not because I want the same thing." Alan shook his head. "But how can I be sure?" "You sounded so okay with it. Like it was something you'd consider." Kathy sighed, frustration and sadness mingling in her expression. "I'm okay with it for them, not for me. I'm with you because I want to. Exclusively." "I thought you knew that." "I thought I did too," Alan admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "But now I don't know what to believe." The room fell silent again, both of them grappling with their emotions. Finally, Kathy moved to sit beside him, her hand resting on his. "Alan, I can't promise you that our relationship will never face challenges or change. But I can promise you this. I love you, and am willing to work through this with you if you'll let me." Her words hung in the air, a lifeline offered in the midst of their turmoil. Alan stared at her, the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who still held his heart despite the doubts clouding his mind. He took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you too, Kathy. But I need time to process this, to figure out where we go from here." She nodded, her grip on his hand tightening slightly. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." As the evening wore on, they sat together in quiet contemplation, their future uncertain, but their love still intact. They both knew it wouldn't be easy, but for now, they had each other, and that was a start. Relationships, to Kathy, were about growth and adaptation. She had spent years observing the people around her, their joys, their struggles, and their failures. Her parents, in particular, were a stark reminder of what could happen when two people clung too tightly to an idea of what a relationship should look like. They stayed together out of fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, and fear of change. Their marriage, once a beacon of love and unity, had withered into something brittle and resentful. Kathy had vowed to herself long ago that she would never repeat their mistakes. But here she was, seated across from Alan at their small dining table, with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. The silence between them was louder than the clink of forks on their plates. Alan's eyes were focused on his meal, but Kathy could tell his mind was far from the food in front of him. She took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Alan," she began softly, her voice almost drowned by the hum of the refrigerator. I feel like we're not on the same page right now. And I hate that." Alan's fork paused midair before he placed it down gently. He looked up, his face weary but sincere. "I just need to know, Kathy," he said, his tone heavy with emotion. Is this something you want? An open relationship?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Kathy hesitated, carefully choosing her next words. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's not something I've seriously considered for us. But I do think it's important to be open-minded about what a relationship can look like. Sometimes, staying connected means evolving together." Alan's expression hardened slightly, and his grip on the edge of the table tightened. "I'm not open-minded about that," he said firmly, his voice low but unwavering. "I want a partner who sees loyalty the same way I do. Someone who doesn't feel the need to look elsewhere." Kathy's eyes softened, though her heart ached at his words. "Alan, it's not about looking elsewhere. It's about understanding that people's needs change over time. And sometimes, the best way to stay connected is to allow for flexibility, to talk about the hard things, even if they scare us." Alan shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "That's not what I signed up for," he said, frustration creeping into his tone. "I want a relationship where we're enough for each other. Just us. That's what I thought we had." "We do have that," Kathy countered, her voice tinged with urgency. "This isn't about me wanting anything different right now. I'm not asking for an open relationship, Alan. I'm saying that we should be willing to talk about what we need as individuals, even if it's uncomfortable." Alan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not your parents, Kathy. And I don't want to be in a relationship where I have to wonder if I'm enough for you." His words landed like a blow, and for a moment, Kathy couldn't speak. She felt her chest tighten as tears threatened to spill, but she held them back. "That's not fair," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I've never made you feel like you weren't enough. This isn't about you, Alan. It's about us. It's about making sure we don't fall into the same patterns I've seen destroy other couples." "But that's not what it looks like for me," Alan said, his voice steady but resolute. "I love you, Kathy. I do. But I can't pretend this isn't a deal breaker for me. I want a relationship that's built to last, not one that stays fresh by tearing down its foundation." Kathy's heart sank, and for the first time, she felt a crack in the foundation of her own beliefs. She wanted to tell Alan that she loved him, that she saw a future with him. But she also knew that their perspectives on this issue were fundamentally different. And that difference loomed over them, an invisible wall that neither of them knew how to tear down. For the next few days, they lived like strangers sharing a home. Their conversations were limited to polite exchanges about groceries and work schedules. The warmth and connection they had once shared seemed to vanish, replaced by a tense, unspoken unease. Alan found himself replaying their conversation over and over in his mind. Was he being unreasonable? Was he clinging too tightly to his ideals? He wanted to believe they could find common ground, but the thought of compromising on something so deeply tied to his sense of self felt impossible. Meanwhile, Kathy tried to focus on the qualities she loved most about Alan: his kindness, his sense of humor, the way he always made her feel safe. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the fear that their differences might be too great to overcome. She hated the idea of losing him, but she also knew she couldn't ignore her own values. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, the silence between them felt heavier than ever. Kathy reached for Alan's hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Alan," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't want to lose you. I don't. But I also don't want us to keep hurting each other like this. Maybe we need to take a step back and really think about what we want." Alan looked at her, his heart breaking at the vulnerability in her eyes. He nodded slowly, his voice raw with emotion. "Maybe you're right," he said. They sat in silence, the weight of their decision pressing down on them like an invisible force. Both of them knew this wasn't the ending they had envisioned, but it felt like the only way forward. The days that followed were filled with quiet reflection. Kathy spent long hours walking through the park, her mind racing with questions. Could she let go of her ideals for Alan? Could she find a way to reconcile their differences without losing herself in the process? Alan, too, found himself questioning everything. He loved Kathy deeply, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that their relationship was built on a foundation that neither of them fully understood. When they finally came together again, their conversation was different. There was no anger, no defensiveness, only honesty. "I don't have all the answers," Kathy admitted, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I know I love you, and I want to figure this out with you if you're willing." Alan looked at her, his own heart torn. "I love you too," he said. "But I think we need to take some time to figure out what we really want, both of us." As they embraced, tears streaming down both of their faces, they knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test their love and their commitment in ways they had never imagined. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they both held on to the hope that, in the end, love would guide them back to each other.